Mark, it's a pleasure to have you. It's CMMC is a huge conversation topic in FedRAMP and a lot of the alphabet soup that goes around it. So really excited to kind of have this conversation with you. And I think the people that will be listening to this afterwards will find it super valuable. So thanks for making the time.
And thanks for having me. Definitely, we see a lot, and I see a lot, lack of knowledge and just confusion throughout the entire industry. So happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. So, on that note, let's actually get started at the very beginning. I think it would be great to tell folks, Mark, a little bit of your background and why we're speaking to you about CMMC, a little bit about DataSure, which is the company you run, the consultancy you run. So let's get started there.
Sure. So I've been involved in lots of government cybersecurity work for, quite frankly, I think 22 or so years now. Interestingly, other agencies besides the Department of Defense, which CMMC is centered around. So for 22 years, I pretty much came in working on behalf of different federal agencies, kind of wearing their hat, making sure the contractors were meeting federal security requirements. So it's been a very interesting thing seeing the entire evolution of cybersecurity when it comes to things like protecting systems and protecting data, especially on the government end. So when CMMC came out a handful of years ago, definitely realized that this was definitely this, number one, makes a lot of sense, and it was going to really help a lot of organizations, because one of the problems that I've seen through the years is I tell people the best standard to choose is simply whatever one you want, because there's so many to pick from. There's so many to choose from. So the fact that DoD came out with CMMC really drives home, number one, the importance of cybersecurity, and then number two, the fact that people need guidance and they need direction as far as exactly what to do. So when CMMC first came out, I kind of jumped on that bandwagon, I guess, from the early days, from when it really first started. Saw the need, saw the benefit, so pretty quickly became not just an RP and an RPO, but a certified assessor, a CCP, and the CCA. I came actually before the certifications existed. There was something called a provisional assessor during this bootstrapping period when they're trying to define and build up CMMC. So I actually became a provisional assessor, and then on top of that became a provisional instructor. So actually I am certified to train the CMMC assessors that are going to be assessing organizations. So I think there's only a handful of us, like 75 or so across the company, of the provisional instructors, again, these certified instructors for teaching assessors how to assess for CMMC. And then with all of that really came about DataSure24, even before CMMC, as I've been doing a lot of the cybersecurity work for these agencies, saw not just on the federal landscape the need for cybersecurity, but on the private businesses, helping organizations do everything from protecting them from ransomware to helping them with incident response and the day-to-day operational tasks. So really that's why we created DataSure, to be able to bridge that gap and to be able to use our experience as both an assessor and as an organizations who themselves need to meet compliance, to help organizations really optimize their resources to meet cybersecurity requirements in a cost-effective manner.
Well, and it's so you're really one of the people that we have to thank when those scary auditors come to our door, because you've trained them.
So the funny thing is, the reason why I'm in cybersecurity, I was a developer years ago. There's a programming language called PHP, where I was one of the core developers of PHP. This was back in the heyday, in the mid 90s, when I was helping develop PHP. And I can tell you, cybersecurity did not exist back then. It was not in anybody's landscape. So in a sense, me doing cybersecurity is me trying to make amends for, quite frankly, the horrible programming practices that we all did.
Well, PHP was powerful, but also you could cut yourself with it, right? So.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's this CMMC is such a huge topic for folks like CyFlare, which is a managed security services provider, but also for all of the MSPs that CyFlare partners with, right? Today we have about 121 or so on last count, MSP partners. And really, the big area of confusion is, hey, how the MSPs are being pulled into the whole CMMC net, and they're trying to figure out what is really our responsibility. Do we have to comply with CMMC? To what level? How do we figure it out? And then number two is, what is all this FedRAMP stuff that's
Sure.
seems to be tied very closely to the hip with CMMC? So
Sure.
unpack this, unpack
Sure.
those two for me.
Sure. And I think the crux really comes down to people understanding the overall intent of CMMC, which I think a lot of people don't quite realize. A lot of people think CMMC is all about cybersecurity, where interestingly, it kind of isn't. CMMC is specific to the federal government and specifically DoD in handling something called CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information. And CMMC, unlike a lot of other cybersecurity models and frameworks which are trying to protect the organization, CMMC actually isn't geared towards that. CMMC is really all focused on protecting data. It is actually a data-centric framework in terms of cybersecurity. It's all about protecting that CUI. So that's really where it needs to all start. And I think you get a lot of understanding once you realize that it's about protecting the data. On one hand, I hate to break the news, DoD doesn't necessarily care about the organization being protected. They want to make sure that that very specific data, that controlled and classified information, is protected. Protected from bad actors, from foreign nations, things like that. So if we start out with understanding we're all about protecting the data, when it comes to CMMC, there's pretty much two what's called assets, which are the crux of the scope when you're trying to be CMMC certified. Number one is, where is your CUI? Because those are the things that we really need to protect, that it's focused on. So there's something called CUI assets, and then there's something called security protection assets. So we need to make sure that we are covering the things that are handling CUI, processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, and then the assets whose responsibility it is to protect that CUI itself. It may not have CUI, but it's that asset's responsibility to protect the CUI. So those are pretty much the two main things. So, in a nutshell, sorry, go ahead.
If I could interrupt real quick for clarification, what you're saying, Mark, is as a distinction, CUI might be, hey, here's like this, confidential diagram or whatever, right, that needs to be protected. That's CUI. A security protection asset is something like a XDR or an EDR solution, or a managed service provider with a SOC, for example, like CyFlare, that's watching the systems and not directly touching the CUI, but we're watching the systems that have it.
Exactly. It is responsible for protecting those CUI assets. Yeah, exactly. So, and that's one of the interesting things. When it comes to CMMC, organizations are getting certified, CMMC certification. And the other misunderstanding is a lot of companies think that they need CMMC for their organization, the whole thing. And it's not actually the case. What CMMC, looking back at that data-centric model, it's really where you're going to draw a box in your system, in your architecture. When you get CMMC certification, you generally want to what's called scope your systems accordingly, so that you draw a box around essentially only those CUI assets or those security protection assets. Now, one of the interesting things that you brought up is, these MSPs and where do they fit in? So years ago, when I used to do assessments for government agencies, there was like this 3 to 5 year, probably 4-year period in which some way, somehow, these contractors got it in their head that if they were to outsource something to somebody else, then somehow they could wash their hands a bit. So I would go into assessments and say, tell me what you do for X, Y, Z. And they'd say, oh, someone else is doing that. We have it outsourced. let's move on. And for a few years, it was a bit of a gray area. One of the things that we since have cleaned that up, don't get me wrong, but what CMMC is making sure of is that you can't simply sweep something under the carpet as far as a security requirement by having somebody else do it. So that's where there's something called flow down provisions and contract inheritance, where if you have a subcontractor doing some work that is, again, protecting CUI or even directly handling CUI, well, they need to meet the same CMMC requirements that you need to meet. You don't get essentially a free pass by having somebody else do the work. So that's what DoD is very concerned about, is really focused on doing, is making sure that essentially anybody that is handling CUI or is responsible for protecting CUI is meeting those same CMMC requirements.
That makes a lot of sense. It's really that chain of custody, right? It's
exactly.
I don't care who's doing the specific work of protecting my data, says DoD. You just need to protect it.
Exactly. And those other people, those third parties, shouldn't be held to a lower standard that you are held to. And that's where a lot of times I'll get third parties come to me and say, well, we have SOC. We have a SOC certification, or we're HIPAA or something like that. Yeah, but it's not CMMC. And to their defense, or to DoD's defense, when you have organizations that are spending the time and the effort to actually get CMMC certification, it's not fair to them to then allow some third party with, that spent lesser money, lesser resources, and have lesser security to be treated as essentially an equal. It's not fair to the people that did put the time and effort into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so on that note, when it comes to protection of assets and that chain of custody, right, when it comes to security, so it seems to me like if a end customer or and I don't understand all the government lingo, right? But the organization that's working directly with the government, if they need to be CMMC level 1 certified or CMMC level 2 certified, and then of course 3, a whole different ball of wax is what I understand. But 1 and 2 for most organizations, it's the managed service provider, which I think CMMC has language for it. They call it like ESP, right? Something like external
service provider.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that external service provider has to match the compliance level. So if an end customer needs to be CMMC level 2, the MSP needs to be CMMC level 2.
Yes-ish. and the reason why I say that is, let's go back to that. It's a data-centric model. And we're talking about protecting CUI and those protection assets that are responsible for protecting those CUI assets. Now, you may have an MSP that, you mentioned about an EDR or an XDR type of solution, but there might be MSPs that they're not responsible for protecting CUI, and they're not handling CUI. So generally speaking, one of the nuances with CMMC is you really need to follow that data. You need to follow that CUI and see where it goes. So, for example, you may have a landscaper. A landscaper, they're probably not handling CUI, and then they're not responsible for the security protections of CUI. So you can absolutely have third parties or external providers that don't even need any CMMC. It really goes down to what level of handling of either CUI or FCI are they going to have. So you might have some third parties that don't need any CMMC, some that need CMMC level 1, and some that need CMMC level 2.
That is really, you're right. That's a really important distinction. What you're saying is, because if you properly segment your organization, right, people, process, technologies, etc., segment out the part of the business that's handling CUI. If an MSP now is not touching that enclave, to use that word, if they're not touching that enclave, then the MSP is out of scope for
absolutely perfect.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So, Mark, on that note, speak a little bit about FedRAMP and how it kind of ties to all of this.
Sure. So, I mentioned earlier about that CMMC. It's all about protection of CUI, and CMMC does have some unique nuances in terms of its standard. So, in order to be CMMC compliant, for example, you need essentially a score of 100%. You need to meet every single practice. There are some frameworks and some standards that you don't need to actually be 100% compliant. You could be 90% compliant and you get a pass and you get a badge and a trophy and all that type of stuff. So one of the unique things about CMMC is there are specific requirements for CMMC certification. And that's why CMMC has been in this unique situation where they can't just allow, as I mentioned before, somebody that has SOC or HIPAA to say, hey, we're good enough. Good enough isn't good enough for CMMC. So there is a standard or a framework called, or certification called FedRAMP. So FedRAMP so when it comes down to pretty much the two most known government standards, I'd say, and most used, there's NIST 800-171, which is what CMMC is based off of. And then there's NIST SP 853. It's a much bigger standard. So, we've been talking about CMMC. One of the unique things about CMMC is people get actually a certification, the CMMC certification. If they get CMMC certification, they're good. They get pretty much a free pass for 3 years. They go through a big assessment, but they don't have to go through annual assessments or quarterly assessments or anything like that. They get that badge that's good for 3 years. Besides CMMC, the only other government-based certification that exists today is something called FedRAMP. So FedRAMP is, for lack of a better term, a certification of NIST 853. So, and FedRAMP falls pretty much close to some of those same type of CMMC assessment methodologies for how, what things need to be met, how they need to be met, etc. So what CMMC said is, all right, we're not going to just accept any third party's word that they're meeting security requirements. But if somebody has FedRAMP, and quite frankly, FedRAMP is a much higher bar than CMMC. Right. FedRAMP has pretty much around 110 individual items that need to be met. That's CMMC. FedRAMP has about 3 times as many. So there is a much higher bar to meet FedRAMP. So CMMC pretty much decided, FedRAMP is very much along the same lines in terms of federal requirements and the specific security controls and practices that need to be met. And it's a much higher standard. They're willing to, during an assessment, to accept FedRAMP to what's called inherit the FedRAMP status and certification by a third party. So generally speaking, if an organization has a third party, if I'm an assessor, let's say, and I'm assessing the organization, going back to a third party needs to be meeting the same requirements. There are 2 ways as an assessor I can check and confirm that that third party is meeting the requirements. Number 1, I'm going to tell the third party to come join the party while I'm assessing the company, and I'm going to ask that third party all of the CMMC questions that need to be asked, and they need to answer and have a score of 100%. That's one thing. I can pull them into the assessment. That's a lot of onus on these third parties. These third parties have lots and lots of companies. Imagine them being pulled into every single assessment for all of their customers. That would be very difficult.
Right.
Or what CMMC allows is us inheriting FedRAMP certification. So if that third party has FedRAMP certification, then I can simply use that certification and kind of in essence check the box instead of having to pull them into the assessment. FedRAMP is the only certification as of today that is allowed to be inherited by CMMC. Now, the caveat with FedRAMP is a pretty arduous process to actually get certification. There is only a handful of companies, I think less than 400 companies in the entire country that have FedRAMP certification. It is a pretty big, arduous process to become FedRAMP. Generally speaking, there's like a 2-year waiting list to even be able to be certified for FedRAMP. So that's FedRAMP certification. You have to go through the government, have government agency come in and do an assessment. Very arduous, expensive process, etc. And you have to wait a long time. One of the things that CMMC has recently come out and clarified is there is the ability, if you are a third-party provider, to have what's called FedRAMP equivalency, to be FedRAMP equivalent, not just FedRAMP certified. So one of the other caveats is FedRAMP was traditionally made for cloud providers and really only made for cloud providers. So we're talking about this government certification, but it was really, the audience was only for a cloud provider. So these managed service providers, some of them are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because they don't want to get pulled into all these assessments, but they actually don't qualify for actual FedRAMP certification because they're not considered a traditional cloud provider. So what CMMC does allow is something called FedRAMP equivalency. It is pretty much going down pretty much the entire path FedRAMP certification, except you're going to hire a certification organization, someone that is authorized to do FedRAMP certification assessments. So you need to hire them. They're going to go through an assessment. You have to have, pass everything, et cetera, but you don't necessarily have to wait in line for the official certification from the government. You can pretty much go right to a certification organization, have them come in, do the assessment, and then you're going to get essentially an equivalency document, which says pretty much everything is good except for the fact, the government agency hasn't signed off on it.
Yeah.
So it really is the same thing as regular FedRAMP.
So speaking in broad brushstrokes, it sounds to me like take any average MSP, right? There are people doing things utilizing software and technologies that they acquire, right, from other providers like Sophos or SentinelOne or what have you. And what you're really saying is, in generally speaking, the MSP needs to think about CMMC compliance, but then as they're thinking about their chain of custody, right, like further down the chain, the tools they use, they really should be looking for tools that are either FedRAMP certified and in the FedRAMP marketplace, or they have a third-party attestation of FedRAMP equivalency.
Yes, that third-party FedRAMP equivalency attestation needs to be, by an actual official FedRAMP certification authority. The other interesting thing, and a little caveat, and the CyberAB, the organization that does oversight and heads up CMMC, they actually just had a meeting last night to further clarify the FedRAMP equivalency. So one of the things that they had mentioned was FedRAMP equivalency is technically harder. It's actually a much higher bar and bigger standard than actual FedRAMP certification. The reason why is FedRAMP certification, you technically can get FedRAMP certification and have findings. You actually don't need a score of 100% to actually get FedRAMP certification. You can have what's called POAMs, Plans of Action and Milestones, and still get FedRAMP certification. However, they just clarified last night, FedRAMP equivalency, you need 100%. You cannot have any findings.
Wow.
So it's a little bit of give and take there. You don't have to go through that arduous actual certification process and wait in line for 2 years, but you need 100% for equivalency.
Yeah, and I assume the rationale behind that is if I'm an agency certifying it, I have the ability to accept the risk, etc. Whereas if I'm getting an equivalency attestation, the agency has no say in that.
Yep, exactly. I think, it's a very, very good point.
So tell me this, one of the things I hear a lot and a lot of debate in the MSP circles is around, does CMMC compliance actually require a U.S. only personnel? Is that a requirement?
So there are two pieces to it. Going back to the original model, it's all about the data. So technically speaking, when it comes to CMMC certification, it's really where that CUI resides. So as of right now, the rules today, and they are working with on a version 2.1, as we speak of CMMC. But the rules today, technically speaking, it's where the data resides and the systems reside. It's not where U.S. citizenship of the people that are managing the systems. So technically, one could get CMMC certification as long as all your assets are in the U.S. and you can have people that are offshore working on the systems, with one little caveat. So that's for CMMC. When we're talking CMMC, let's keep in mind we're talking about DoD, the Department of Defense. So DoD and about protecting CUI, controlled and classified information. There are certain CUI that particular type of CUI requires U.S. citizenship to be handling. So things that have ITAR requirements. ITAR requirement says only U.S. citizens can access that information. So technically for CMMC, no, you can actually get away with personnel outside of the U.S. that aren't citizens. However, if that data has ITAR requirements that require U.S. citizenship, technically, I guess you could probably get CMMC, but you wouldn't be meeting the other requirements. Actually, you probably couldn't get CMMC because you're not meeting the dissemination requirements. CMMC has one of the requirements that says you are handling CUI as you should be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, it's with CMMC, it really is the devil is in the details. And, it's really important to scope, really important to understand the nuances. One of the things that, going back to the 30,000-foot view, a lot of MSPs are currently debating as to, should I start looking at CMMC? Should I not? If I do, when do we start the process for readiness and certification, etc.? What are the requirements? Are there any requirements for MSPs to be certified by a deadline date? Can you speak a little bit to all of those things?
Sure. So right now, CMMC is not official yet. It's not live yet. They're still working on it. They're very, very close. In fact, we're pretty much just waiting for it to go through Congress, and Congress needs to approve it. So we're pretty much waiting for Congress. When Congress is going to get to it, it could be as early as this October of 2024. It could be spring of 2025. Probably most likely it's going to be October of 2025. But again, it could drop at any moment. So in terms of those dates, we've typically been telling people to pretty much plan for next October to have CMMC requirements. Now, those are requirements. That's the time in which you need to have CMMC certification for any new contract. Well, we need to work backwards from there now. How long is it going to take us to get our act together to be compliant? And most programs that we're doing and we're seeing now is usually around a 12 to 18 month readiness program to help build up your CMMC program so that it is compliant. So if we work backwards about next October, if we're talking a best case scenario of 12 months, organizations need to be starting by this October to get all of their ducks in a row in order to be compliant. But with that said, we have to work backwards even more. It's going to take 12 months to build a compliant program. They still need to go through that assessment. And that assessment could take anywhere from 1 to 3 months. So now we're talking about a year, this October to start. But you also need to backfill the 3 months, let's just say, for an assessment. And we're kind of talking about now. People need to start moving in order to be compliant, to be able to be getting these contracts.
Yeah, the time is now. That's a really good point. And talking about that too, I like how you called it CMMC readiness, Mark, because the general thought process is for MSPs that I've talked to is, hey, let's go do a CMMC gap assessment. But that means the scope has already been defined, and there's just so much nuance to all of these things that it's really about saying, let's not even worry about the assessment. Let's just first strategize on how we are going to achieve or create a pathway to CMMC. Then we'll worry about the assessment.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of organizations, are kind of starting out backwards because they're thinking in the traditional, I think, cybersecurity mindset of I need to secure my systems. I just need to have good cyber hygiene. Let me see where my gaps are, and I'll fill in the gaps. But CMMC is really about it's actually what's called a maturity model. There needs to be institutionalization of processes and procedures. You need to have that score of 100%. Good enough isn't good enough. So, and one of the other key things is because we're not actually talking about securing an organization, we're talking about securing and protecting that CUI, that data. It's a different mindset to the point of we've seen a lot of times these gap assessments don't really help an organization because it doesn't, to your point, give them the path that they need. I tell people when I do training all the time, the biggest factor in an organization with CMMC certification, essentially making or breaking a certification, is, believe it or not, scoping more than anything else for an organization. Drawing that box. I've seen organizations that draw a box around their entire company, and there is no way that they can meet it. The interesting thing about DoD is, and when we're talking about securing that information, protecting that information, DoD really doesn't necessarily care if you're putting controls in place to protect that information or you're decreasing the surface area. You're decreasing that possible attack surface in which that CUI exists. To DoD, that is equally just as good. And a lot of organizations think they need to throw money at this and just buy lots of stuff to protect the CUI. And sometimes it's no, just take that CUI out of places that it shouldn't be in anyway. So it really forces that conversation of organizations to really discuss where is our CUI and do we really need it in all these places? And do we really need all these people accessing that CUI? So that's essentially that first step that needs to be taken. And we've seen the biggest improvement, which flies in the face of a traditional gap assessment. Right. It is, we need to close our doors first and really make sure we know what we're talking about, and then kind of build that program that's meeting the CMMC requirements.
Yeah, and if done right and if scoped correctly, instead of like making just a swag at it and going after it, the value there is it's going to be more defensible, from a CMMC scoring perspective. It's probably going to be cheaper. And frankly, because it's about maturity and people and processes as much as it is about technology, it also means your people are going to be able to actually do it correctly over and over consistently, so you're not in trouble. So
absolutely. They'll have that institutionalization. Yeah. So on average, for most of the organizations that we do something like a readiness program, they typically have been told and have budgeted, have in their mind around $120,000 for building their program, throwing all that technology in there. That's typically what they have been told and kind of originally planned, using the traditional non-readiness, finding some gaps and plugging the gaps. On average, most of our customers that actually go through a readiness program end up spending less than half that amount. They're spending around 50 to 60K instead of 100K on building that program. That's how much of a difference doing proper program plan and proper scoping, how much of an impact it has.
Yeah. Don't be penny wise, pound foolish, right?
Absolutely.
With CMMC readiness, as just like with your law firm or your accountants, makes a lot of sense. Mark, this has been a pleasure. I'm sure people watching this will want to know, how do they get a hold of, how can they get a hold of you? Yeah, and yeah, are there resources that they can go to that you've put out that you'd like to kind of reference, or the DataSure website? Any kind of
Yeah,
contact would be
absolutely.
great.
Sure. Yeah, we have a lot of blogs, a lot of videos on our DataSure24 .com website. I know our LinkedIn, I believe, also has our corporate website has a lot of videos and whatnot. And we've been talking about CMMC since literally day one with CMMC. So we've seen the changes, and you can actually see in our all of our videos the progression of the entire CMMC program. So absolutely, you can contact info@datasure24.com, or feel free to go to the website.
Well, again, Mark, appreciate the time and for just unpacking CMMC for us a little bit. CyFlare is really all about making sure that we're doing the right things, not necessarily the things that make us the most money, right? And so providing this kind of insight, I think, is going to be super meaningful to our partners and our customers. So again, thanks for the time, Mark.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.